Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on March 21st, 2025. By the time that Donald Trump returned to the White House on January 20th of this year, he had promised repeatedly to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. Well, that was 2 months ago, and there's still no end in sight for the war. This week, Trump appeared to make some small progress in his purported pursuit of peace when he spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin by telephone. In that conversation, the two presidents reportedly agreed to a 30-day cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. In Ukraine, the Zelensky regime responded by saying that it was willing to consider such a ceasefire, but within a day or so of the Trump-Putin call, Russia claimed that Ukraine had violated the ceasefire by attacking an oil depot in Russia. So, despite his efforts, Trump's peace initiative appears to be sputtering. Now, here to discuss this with me is John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau there, independent of financial or commercial or national ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard University, John has also been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism, and an advisor to governments, including those of Greece and Australia. He's also published several books on military and political topics. His latest book, which we plan to discuss in another episode soon, is titled Long Live Novichok, the British Poison Which Fooled the World. Thank you, John, for joining me again on Reason to Resist.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Good to be back.
So, John, after Trump had a long call with Vladimir Putin this week, he spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the State Department's readout of the conversation described their call as fantastic. Hyperbole aside, numerous aspects of this readout were interesting to me. One was that Zelensky is reported to have thanked Trump for providing Javelin missiles to Ukraine in his first administration. As the readout notes, Trump was the first president to provide these weapons to Ukraine. And I just want to note as an aside that although Trump claims to be blameless in the eruption of this war, it was Trump, not Obama, who began arming Ukraine. But in my opinion, an even more interesting aspect of this readout was the following statement. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So John, Trump seems to think that the solution to every conflict is for the U.S. to take ownership of whatever assets the parties are fighting about. He recently claimed that the solution to the war in Gaza, for example, was for the U.S. to own Gaza. Now he's apparently proposing that the U.S. take ownership of Ukraine's energy plants. What do you make of this? Do you think it's serious? Do you think this stands any chance of happening? And what do you think is motivating Trump to propose this?
It's very amusing. Not so funny if you're on the receiving end of Trump's tweeted threats. But this is a new issue. And it duplicates the idea that Trump has been pushing of not U.S. boots on the ground or a U.S. military force to defend the Ukraine, but a U.S. investment in, first of all, rare earth metals. That was 2 weeks ago. And now he surfaced, without having mentioned it to President Putin and without having surfaced this before, the idea that the U.S. would take over Khmelnytsky, the Western nuclear power plant, and possibly others. There are two odd things about this. One is what Trump seems to be saying is if you put enough American money into the country, Russia wouldn't dare attack it. Therefore, American money instead of American boots on the ground represents a form of long-term security for the Ukraine. And the cost of that long-term security is not Ukraine buying or borrowing or receiving US arms, but Ukraine giving up resources. There's something very amusing about this. Khmelnytsky and all of the Western Ukrainian nuclear power plants currently working at reduced capacity are being supplied by processed uranium fuel that doesn't come from the United States. It's called the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. But the Westinghouse Electric Corporation, the US corporation, was sold to a Canadian group. Canadian, the enemy, the Canadian enemy, bought out Westinghouse nuclear reactor and processed uranium fuel businesses in 2022 for about $8 billion. And currently in Toronto, the Cameco company and the Brookfield, if I've got it right, yes, Brookfield Corporation of Toronto owns the nuclear fuel supply to the Ukraine and also owns the development of the Khmelnytsky. That's in the west of Ukraine. And that's the only kind of Ukrainian nuclear power producing electric assets which Trump could be conceivably talking about. Of course, Zelensky of Kiev wants to talk about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, but that's in Zaporozhye region, and that's now Russia. There is no way Russia will ever concede the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to American ownership or to anyone else's ownership other than Russian. But the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant have all come not from Russia, but from the Ukraine. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is supposedly monitoring nuclear safety at Zaporozhye, has been covering up at US request the endless efforts by the Ukrainians to destroy Zaporozhye and cause a release of nuclear energy. So what Trump has come up with is another variant of American money, his friends, his corporate lobbyists, and the Witkoff's type of a relationship with business would produce a kind of financial profitable dividend for an end of war settlement. To say this is preposterous is to refer to what the Russian reaction is, to expose what it means in the mental thinking of the Trump administration. It's a bit more interesting, but somebody forgot to tell Trump Westinghouse isn't a US corporation, it's a Canadian one.
And interestingly, Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister, was the chair of the board of Brookfield, the acquirer of Westinghouse at the time of the acquisition. He was, yes. In fact, this has been a subject of some conversation here because the opponents are trying to characterize him, I think with complete justification, as being a corporate bigwig and someone who's more inclined to protect the interests of the corporate sector than ordinary Canadians. But one question I have about all of this, John, wasn't it the case at the time that the special military operation began in early 2022 that the U.S. government had already and U.S. businesses had already made significant investments in Ukraine? Or because of the theory being that if we buy up enough assets, no one will attack us, including the Russians or Ukraine, irrespective of whatever provocations might occur. But I would have thought that already by the time you get to early 2022, American businesses had significant interest there. And of course, the Americans were providing substantial weaponry to Ukraine and promoting business interests. Isn't that the case?
Yes, it is. It's the case with all the Europeans and Canadian and US schemes of assisting Ukraine, that there were business deals that went in parallel. The buying up, for example, of Ukrainian farmland. I can't tell you, because I don't focus most of my time on the Ukraine, how much Ukrainian farmland has now been acquired by Dutch, US, multinational, and other European interests as a cheap agricultural producer, which eventually would produce cheap agricultural products to be brought back into Europe and destroy European producers. Yes, as I recall, because I focused primarily on the US pressure to supply IMF funding through the Ukrainian banking system into the oligarch pockets, Igor Kolomoisky, Gennady Bogolubov, Viktor Pinchuk, and others. The US pumped a lot of IMF money into the Ukraine through the banking system into the Ukrainian oligarchs. Much of that came back. Both Bogolubov and Kolomoisky bought American assets, steel mills and various other things in the United States. But there were a lot of American speculators buying Ukrainian bonds, sovereign bonds, in the belief that whether the country went under or not, whether the bonds became defaulted or not, the US government would always honor them. So buying cheap Ukrainian bonds, which the market thought might default, was a good buy if you could count on the US government to honor the debt and cover the debt. So yes, there's been all of that going on, and lots of people fighting wars make profits. This is no different.
I asked simply because it seems to undercut this claim that American investments in Ukraine are going to shield Ukraine from any future hostilities from the Russian Federation. Would you agree that that's
it's a nonsense?
Yeah. So
it's a nonsense.
Let's turn to the subject of this energy infrastructure ceasefire for a moment. As I mentioned at the outset, Russia claims that Ukraine attacked an oil depot in the Russian Federation almost immediately following this telephone agreement, in which apparently Vladimir Putin gave the order to the Russian military to cease attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Do you believe that this in fact happened, this attack by Ukraine? And if so, what do you think the Zelensky regime is trying to accomplish by tanking this ceasefire agreement so quickly?
Well, the pumping station is Kazanskaya, and it's in Krasnodar region, and it services the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. So it's not Russian oil; it's Kazakh oil. And this is not the first time. I think about 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainian drones attacked another oil storage. This is Kazakh oil that's piped from across the Caspian Sea, the Akhtar oil field, and it is loaded on tankers at Novorossiysk and exported for the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which has part Russian, part American, part Kazakh ownership. What we can see, thanks to an Italian military radar website, is that for the first time in many years, 2 US aircraft, electronic warfare aircraft, were operating over in international airspace of the Black Sea, aiming at Crimea and the Krasnodar coastline. And this is the first time in many years, according to the Italians who know this better than me. And what it shows is the US is escalating its capacity to direct Ukrainian attacks on Russia. At the same time, Zelensky said that he did not agree to implement the ceasefire on his side until after the experts groups had met in Saudi Arabia, and that's not due for Monday or Tuesday. So Zelensky said, I agree in principle, but not in fact, and then attacked with US help. What the Russian side did, according to their announcements, was that Putin gave an immediate order to stand down on attacks on energy infrastructure. And the reports by the military bloggers in Moscow that I've read are that the Russian air batteries, anti-aircraft batteries, you can hear some in the background, but that's fireworks, shot down a group of Russian drones on their way to an energy target. But I have to make a general point and a particular point. In the readout issued, as you said, by Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz, the reference is to attacks, a partial ceasefire against energy. That's the way they wrote the English. They weren't trying to write it in Russian or Ukrainian. They wrote a partial ceasefire against energy. I'm looking down to read the paper. Against energy. What the hell does that mean? How can you conduct a serious negotiation in the middle of a serious war that threatens all of us, and you get the words wrong, to get the words vague, to get the words ambiguous. Trump did something similar in his tweet. So what we have here is that Trump, Rubio, and Waltz are premature ejaculators. They put in English vague expressions of success at doing something that hasn't happened, but they would like to have happened, and they expect their enemy, the Russian Federation, to fall in line, salute, click heels, and do what they tell them. Well, as you read out, Dimitri, correctly, President Zelensky thanked. This expression occurs, I'm holding up the paper. The audience can see it's just 2 pages here, 1.5 pages. I counted the words, 480 words. That takes about 180 seconds to read. The words Trump and leadership are used every 32 words, every 10 seconds. This paper, which purports to be a serious attempt at making peace to end a serious war in Europe, is in fact an attempt to celebrate a Trump achievement, which wasn't.
So, well, incompetence at a bare minimum. But I want to make sure I understand your reading of all of this, John, because when you told me that I wasn't aware that these surveillance aircraft of the United States military were operating over the Black Sea at that particular point in time, it immediately occurred to me there were 3 possibilities. One was Trump is duplicitous. He entered into an agreement and violated what he understood the terms of the agreement to be. The other was that there was just a miscommunication, some kind of a screw up in the chain of command. And the third is that the U.S. military was trying to undermine what Donald Trump was doing. That I don't know. But as I understand your read of all of this, it is the former, the first of those explanations, that this is just indicative of incompetence, the sheer incompetence of the Trump administration in setting forth terms of a ceasefire that were susceptible to misinterpretation. Have I got that right? Is that how you read this?
Well, some in our audience go for the conspiracy theory that underneath President Goodwill Trump and his loyalists, there are a bunch of deep state officials attempting to sabotage what he's doing. There's another part of our audience which would say, cock up. The fact is that President Trump has installed a bunch of loyalists at the very top, but they have very inadequate bureaucratic control and command and control running down, and that they simply don't know what's happening. Well, there are always combinations of this from case to case. In my view, you hit on the right point. President Trump controls a PR display that extends from his Oval Office to his principal underlings, the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. These chaps issue tweets. It's a set of government by tweets, a vast tweet machine in which all of them participate, and worse, or rather interesting, because I'll show it in the Dances with Bears that'll follow our program. I'll just let the audience read these tweets. They each quote each other. So you've got a tweet retweeting, a tweet of Trump's being repeated by Rubio and Waltz as if it's gospel. Well, underneath this system, there's no command and control. One gets the impression, and you raised it with respect to the Trump's interest in American takeover of nuclear power plants in the west of the Ukraine. These people don't seem to read the consequences sections of the decision memoranda that normally come to people. Indeed, I would, from the way they perform, Waltz is probably the most incompetent for his job. The job of the National Security Advisor is to assemble all the options in a single decision-making memorandum presented to the president with a bunch of boxes, and he can cross them or tick them. I mean, that was in my day in Carter administration. I don't know whether they used boxes, ticks, pencils, or pens, or Trump simply puts his thumb on something. I don't know how it's done now, but the principle is ancient. A decision-making memorandum with a bunch of options, and the president, as the supreme commander, picks them. But in this particular case, in all of these cases that we're talking about, there's no evidence that they've calculated the consequences of anything they announce as a success. It's premature ejaculation without a target, without a future, without a single regard for what happens next.
Yes.
Extraordinary. I don't believe the US government has been in this situation before, not in my lifetime. And what does it mean underneath? Leaving aside the cock-up theory, what does it mean? Well, you go again to this piece of paper I'm waving at you, and you see that ultimately, you see the line again. President Trump, and I'm reading from it, also asked President Zelensky about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war, including the ones that had been abducted. President Trump promised to work closely with both parties to help make sure these children were returned home. This is a line that's pure propaganda. It's a fiction that Russia forcibly abducted children from the Donbas area. And it appears over and over in Ukrainian propaganda for the last 2 or 3 years. It's false. And there we have Trump, Rubio, and Waltz announcing again, because they did it again in the Jeddah joint statement. What's the matter with these people? They're a broken record. They keep allowing themselves to have their text dictated by Zelensky's PR machine. Well, this isn't seriously indicative of a United States government, let alone President Trump, the president of peace, making a balanced effort to find terms of agreement between two sides. This is evidence that the United States government under Trump takes the Ukrainian side.
Right. And is in no position to act as a neutral arbiter between the Ukrainians and the Russians. I have to say, John, I'm in total agreement that we've descended into amateur hour at the White House. And I've been saying for weeks that even if Trump is serious about putting an end to this war, and I have my doubts about that, I don't think his administration has the competence and sophistication to do it. And things are likely to take their natural course on the battlefield, and that is where this will ultimately be decided, I think.
Well, to give our audience some anticipation of how to read what's going to happen this coming week, what we can say is this. For the first time after the Putin-Trump call, the Russian side beat out the Americans by several hours in identifying exactly what was said, or their version of what was said, their readout, plus what was agreed. The Trump administration had hours of delay to figure out and coordinate what they were going to say. What the Russians have also done since then is to have announced who will lead the Russian expert groups in Saudi Arabia in the coming week. Gregory Karazin, a deputy foreign minister, a former deputy foreign minister, now a member of Russian Parliament, State Duma, will be one, and Sergei Beseda, which is a colonel general of the FSB, will be the second leader of the Russian expert group. Now, both of them highly experienced at diplomatic negotiations, at war-related negotiations, at Ukraine-related negotiations. Now, the Russians have announced Karazin and Beseda. Okay, who are the Americans? the US side has got to match in rank and in experience the Russian side. But the Russian side have already named their people. The fact that the US, having promised to do this weeks ago, can't indicates that they're quarreling between the agencies. If Grigory Karasin is the leader at the at deputy foreign minister level, then who's the deputy foreign minister on the Secretary of State side? Well, that's either Kurt Campbell, who's the deputy Secretary of State, Rubio's deputy, but he's a China warfighter. He's not an expert on this region. So he's likely to kick it down to an assistant secretary level, except that the assistant secretary for Europe hasn't been formally appointed yet. It's an acting level job. It's occupied by a chap called Louis Bono. Louis Bono is known to the Russians as the man who manipulated the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna to take the view that it was the Russians trying to attack Zaporozhye, not the Ukrainians. He's got a record as a Russia warfighter. Is he going to suddenly be the expert to negotiate? By kicking it down to Bono, you kick the Trump's ball out of the field. Then what about who's going to match General Sergei Beseda? A general, a colonel general. That's a high rank. Who's going to rank on the U.S. side? On the intelligence agency, Michael Ellis is deputy director of CIA, but he's a lawyer. A lawyer can negotiate, but not a master of the detail. So what I'm saying here, Dimitri, is the more you look at the detail, the more you're dismayed. You've got at one level Trump tweeting, echoed, retweeted, reposted, reinvigorated every 10 seconds by his underlings. But implementation, they haven't got. And they can't solve an argument between state, CIA, and Pentagon on something as important as this. Why? Because these chaps don't agree on how to end the war.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now,
or whether to go on fighting the war.
Right. I'd like to talk to you about some details of the readouts of the Trump-Putin call, which you referenced earlier a moment ago. And again, this is something that particularly caught my eye. The U.S. readout of the call I thought was mostly platitudes.
Yes.
But one paragraph was, I think, potentially important. And it was this: the leaders spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. Now, this week, John, as I'm sure you know, Israel resumed its savage bombing attacks on the Gaza Strip. In one day, Israel's military reportedly killed more than 400 Palestinians in Gaza, the highest one-day death toll since its war on the population of Gaza began in October 2023. At the same time, the U.S. military resumed its bombing of Yemen, killing dozens of Yemenis, including children and women, in one series of attacks. And when it resumed bombing Yemen, the Trump administration pointedly warned Iran that the U.S. would hold it responsible if Yemen attacked Israel or resumed attacking shipping in the Red Sea. Now, John, although the U.S. readout of the call between Trump and Putin explicitly referred to Iran, the Russian readout did not. And here's all that the Russian readout said about the situation in the Middle East. Quote, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump also addressed some other international issues, including the situation in the Middle East and in the Red Sea region. Joint efforts will be made to stabilize the situation in the crisis spots and establish cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security. This will in turn contribute to improving the overall ambiance of relations between Russia and the United States. One positive example is the recent vote in the UN on a resolution on the Ukraine conflict in which the two countries aligned their stances. So, John, 3 days before Trump returned to the White House in January, Russia and Iran signed an important partnership agreement. The government of Vladimir Putin has repeatedly described Russia's relations with Iran as being of strategic importance. And both Russia and China have held military exercises with Iran, In fact, just this month, Iran, Russia, and China conducted joint naval drills in the Gulf of Oman, marking the fifth year that the three countries have conducted military drills together. So, what do you make of the statement, John, about Iran in the US readout of the Trump Putin call? And more broadly, do you think the government of Vladimir Putin, as some people are suggesting in the alternative media, would consider throwing Iran under the bus to win concessions on Ukraine from the Trump administration?
A categorical no on the last point, but let's go back to the details and answer your question. You're a good lawyer, Dimitri, and you know very well that the language was the leaders shared a view.
Correct.
That doesn't mean they agreed. What it means is that Trump said something about Iran not ever being in a position to destroy Israel. And Putin has a special relationship with Israel. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Um, but there was no agreement between the two of them that that would support Trump's subsequent tweets, in which he's said that if Iran doesn't stop arming the Houthis, they will be attacked and destroyed like the Houthis are. The tweet I'm looking at about the Trump's the language is the Houthis will be completely annihilated. The tweet about Iran is that let's see what he had to say. Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire exclamation point. These are Trump's threats. They represent an alliance between Trump and Israel to attack Iran and eliminate the last vestige of resistance to an expansionist Israel since the destruction and partition of Syria. Yes, I've seen, as you referred to, speculation that the reason President Putin gave up the support of Bashar al-Assad and his regime and did not defend it against the Turkish supported HTS attack out of Idlib, did not prevent the Israelis bombing all Syrian military installations and the expansion of Israeli occupation to the suburbs of Damascus. I don't believe for a minute that the Russian side made any form of secret or implicit deal that if the US will accommodate Russia on the Ukraine battlefield, Russia will accommodate Israel and the United States and Turkey on the Syrian battlefield. What I think has happened, I did report earlier in the week in Dances with Bears, but essentially this is how I see it. On the one hand, Russia's got a Ukraine war against Europe, war from the United States against the Russian economy. These are the wars that Russia's fighting. In those wars, and it's more than the Ukrainian battlefield, Turkey is a very important Russian asset. Turkey is a major consumer of Russian gas. Turkey and the Erdogan regime is a major supporter of sanctions busting, and that's very important. It's a priority for Russian strategy at the moment. It was therefore last November when the Russian intelligence could see what the Turks were doing. They were readying the so-called HTS troops to break out of Idlib and attack southwards. The Russians could see it. And there was an argument between the general staff and the Kremlin over what could be done to deter the Turks or to oppose the Turks. The decision was made not to oppose, but to warn Assad and to try to mobilize his domestic capabilities to resist. They weren't enough. They were far from enough. Second, President Putin has a personal relationship with Israel. He supports what Israel does. He has also ordered that no Russian anti-aircraft or missile defense to defend Syria would ever be used to threaten Israeli attacks all over Syria. That's long-standing. We don't have the time to explain why that's personal for Putin, but it is. That meant that Russia would not threaten to use its military assets against Israeli attack in support of the Israeli invasion across down the slopes of the Golan Heights and heading towards Damascus. Third, the Russians understood that the Americans would destroy, and as they threatened to do, any Iranian aircraft trying to reinforce with troops the Bashar al-Assad regime, which had to fly from Iran into Khmeimim Air Base. One aircraft took off. It was turned around under US threat to shoot it down. The Russian position was that it wasn't going to get into a shooting match with the United States over that. That meant that the Iranians couldn't reinforce. Fourth, the Russian position was that it would preserve the bases as best it could without having to fight for them, and would then begin to dismantle those bases at the Russian speed. And Tartus, the naval base, has been progressively used to unload military equipment, loaded on vessels. Those vessels are mostly heading towards the Western Mediterranean now, or are already out. One major submarine with significant missile capability is anchored offshore, which is a warning that were there to be attempted killing Russians, significant firepower remains underwater offshore. But that's a warning. It's a flag. It won't be used. At Khmeimim, the Russians have opened the gates and brought in some 8,000 or 9,000, possibly more, Alawi fleeing for their lives from the genocidal attacks from the HTS, which is backed from the air by Turkish drones and Turkish helicopters. Khmeimim's not going to shoot them down. There's no likelihood, as I understand it, that Russia will airlift those refugees out of Syria into Russia. What will happen is unique and is not widely discussed in Russia, because this is very sensitive and it relates to all these broader issues. But essentially, Khmeimim has done more for the refugees than anyone else, any of the other powers, but it's not enough to stop a genocide, obviously. These are highly situationally specific Russian calculations, and they are not part of a deal for the Ukraine. There's evidence that the Russian side believes that the tripartite partition, Turkey retakes Latakia and Alexandretta and the whole western coastline of Syria as it had in 1914, that's unstable. That the Israeli occupation of southern Syria between the Golan and Damascus is unstable, and that the American occupation from Al-Tanf in the southeast near the Jordanian border up to the Iraqi border and the Turkish border in the east is unstable. The Russian calculation, but it's not going to be discussed in public, not like I'm saying it, and it's not going to be written about. The Russian calculation is that Syria is an Arab state, and it will, any power for the last 5,000 or 6,000 years that has tried to partition and break up Arab Syria. Well, there aren't Arabs for 5,000 years, but the point's still the same. No empire that tried to break up Syria could do that for long. And the calculation, I believe, on the Russian side is they have to play for time. That looks passive. in relation to the genocide against the Alawi, it might be termed immoral, but I don't believe it's immoral. It reflects these calculations of war, especially in relation to Turkey, but it's not part of a short-term deal for American concessions, trading concessions in the Ukraine. In the long term, the Russians believe in a sovereign, unified Arab Syria, but it's up to the Syrian Arabs to fight, and I believe they will eventually, but eventually could be a lot longer than I've got to live. In the long term, Syria will break the partition. The Syrian Arabs will, and Russia's betting on the long term.
Now, earlier in your response, you said that Putin personally supports Israel. I just have two questions about that. I mean, first of all, the Russian Federation's rhetoric publicly with respect to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians has been quite harsh, particularly at the United Nations.
Yes.
Very, very harsh condemnation. And secondly, I had the opportunity to interview the Russian ambassador to Canada last year, and we talked about this very issue. He mentioned, for example, that a lot of Israelis are also Russian, and that there are a number of competing concerns that Russia has to weigh in terms of how to deal with Israel. But he pointed out that there is no provision of arms to Israel, whereas, of course, many Western powers are providing weaponry to Israel. So I was a bit struck by your statement that Putin personally supports Israel. It seems to me the situation's rather more complicated than that. Would you agree?
I definitely agree. It's not any more complicated. The General Staff made very clear when the Israelis caused an ambush that resulted in the killing of 15 Russian airmen on board an electronic surveillance plane that was shot down, quotes, by a Syrian battery by mistake. But in fact, what had happened was an Israeli aircraft caused spoofed the situation, so that causing the Syrians to open fire. This was a terrible event in which the General Staff announced publicly that they blamed Israel, and they wanted to see not exactly revenge, but they wanted to see blame and responsibility placed where it was, and they wanted to see the Kremlin respond. In fact, what happened, and I wasn't quite prepared for the dates of this, but President Putin had a one-on-one conversation without interpreters with Benjamin Netanyahu, and let's just say agreed not to have the General Staff dictate the Russian reaction to the Israeli ambush and killing of those 15 Russian Air Force men. That was one example of the special relationship that's personal between President Putin and the Israelis, and it's hotly disputed in private by the General Staff, by many members of the Foreign Ministry, and it's not new. It's gone on for many, many years now.
Right.
It's not discussed. It's not analyzed. To some extent, I've done so in print, but it doesn't help modify the situation. You're right. There is lots of Russian sympathy for the Palestinians and understanding that what's happened in Gaza has been genocide that's intolerable. At the same time, as the ambassador told you, Russia tries to temper its condemnation with the concerns of so-called Russian citizens dual citizens in Israel. It's even pursued with Hamas the release of Russian passport-carrying Israelis who've been held hostage. Do we need to talk a bit more about this?
No, I actually wanted to turn to Iran again because I still one thing I'm very curious to have your view on is, if it comes to a U.S. attack on Iran, how far do you think the Russian Federation will go to assist Iran?
Well, you mentioned the strategic pact that was signed by the presidents of Russia and Iran in January. The fact is that the mutual security or reciprocal security provisions of that pact were not different from the wording of a pact agreed between Russia and Iran early in Putin's term, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. As I recall, there was no commitment of reciprocal defense. It simply stated that that each side will not help another country that is attacking a party to the agreement. So, for example, if somebody attacks Iran, the Russians won't help the attacker. But that's
Correct.
as far as it will. Yeah. So, but at the same time, there is this characterization of the relationship as being of strategic importance. There are, as I mentioned, these military exercises. I can't imagine that the Russians would view positively any attempt by the United States to squash all resistance to U.S. hegemony in the region by destroying the
and so there are multiple channels in which Russia assists Iran to defend itself. Missile capabilities, air defense capabilities, satellite and other forms of electronic detection and early warning capability. All of this runs below the level of the president and below the level of public disclosure. And in that pact, there's quite a lot of reinforcement of intelligence sharing and military cooperation. Russia will do and is doing its utmost to deter both Israel and the United States and hangers on like the British or the French from undertaking a significant attack to destroy any major element of Iran's defense, including its nuclear capabilities. So the question of what happens if Trump decides to ignore the deterrence and tries to order a major combination Israeli-American attack on Iran. What do the Russian side do in such a situation? For obvious reasons, deterrence works in secret. Deterrence works against the Americans and the Israelis by not disclosing what the answer to my question will be. My conviction is that through all of the channels the Russians use to assist Iran to defend itself, the Russian strategy is not different now. It's a permanent strategy. It's not different now from Stalin's strategy in the 1940s. Stalin believed that Iran would be a springboard for Anglo-American attacks on the Russian South. And he did his best to protect the Soviet Union at the time including putting Soviet Red Army troops in Iran and assisting and encouraging the overthrow of the Iranian Shah at the time, because it was the calculation in Moscow that the Shah was no more than a stooge for the British and the Americans. So ultimately, coming back to your question, Dimitri, Russia's view of Iran is not only almost 100 years old, it's nearly 200 years old. And it cannot be that Russia will allow Iran to become again a springboard for Anglo-American attack on the Russian Caucasus, on the Russian South. So there's a fundamental line that's being drawn there. I don't believe it's being said, but there is a line being drawn there, and let's say the preparations are being done in secret to make that pact operational to a degree that would deter an American-Israeli combination to attack Iran.
Right. I'd like to move on finally to, I suppose, a more lighthearted subject, and that is the public commentary of Dmitri Medvedev, something I've been wanting to ask you for some time. And I'd like to quote, for the benefit of our audience, a couple of examples to get your insights into this, the extraordinarily colorful analyst that Dmitri Medvedev has become. He served as president, for those who might not recall, of the Russian Federation from 2008 to 2012, and as prime minister from 2012 to 2020. And although he's no longer the president or prime minister of Russia, he's deputy chairman, Dmitry Medvedev, of the Security Council of Russia. He's undoubtedly a powerful and influential figure in the Russian government. And throughout the Ukraine war, his public commentary, John, as I'm sure you've noted, is far more inflammatory than statements made by Vladimir Putin or the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov.
Yeah.
And I want to focus on two examples from recent weeks. On March 14th, Medvedev tweeted as follows in English: UK updates Trump. Russia should accept the proposal for a ceasefire in Ukraine without any conditions, says the British Foreign Secretary. Britain and its minister can shove their idea back up the shithole it came from, diplomatically speaking. And then 4 days later, Medvedev tweeted as follows, again in English: the phone call between Presidents Putin and Trump proved a well-known idea. There is only Russia and America in the dining room. On the menu, light appetizers, Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips, and Paris rooster. The main course is a Kiev-style cutlet. Enjoy your meal. Now, John, as I recall, Medvedev... Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, he didn't mean rooster. He meant coq au vin.
Right.
Brussels sprouts, fish and chips, coq au vin. That's what he meant.
Right. Right. Now, as I recall, when Medvedev was president and prime minister, he tended to employ rather more statesman-like language than this.
Yeah.
And all of that seemed to change. I guess the simple interpretation, John, is that, since the special military operation began, the decision was made that Medvedev would play the role of bad cop to Vladimir Putin's good cop. Is it as simple as that?
Yes.
What do you think is going on here?
Yes, there is a deliberate attempt to make public a bad cop, good cop routine between former President Medvedev and current President Putin. But that isn't all it is. Second, Dmitry Medvedev's relatively young and is a contender for the succession. President Putin is likely to retire in 2030. He could run for another 6 years. He may not. But everything said at that level has to be understood as presidential succession politics. Therefore, you have to understand that Medvedev isn't talking just to Foreign Minister Lamy of England. We'll come back to why he referred to that gentleman's shithole in a minute. Medvedev is talking, albeit in English, at his Russian constituencies, and he's reflecting a very clear consensus that he's articulating in the Security Council. That's the general staff, the military, the intelligence services, the diplomatic, the foreign ministry, the diplomatic service, and interior security. Now, all of those folks do not have to have the level of respect, kindliness, reciprocity that President Putin believes it's necessary to show towards President Trump. Okay? So Medvedev is reflecting a consensus of Russian views. Certainly my father-in-law, most Russians I know, think exactly this way. And Medvedev is saying it, albeit in English.
Right.
So he's reflecting a consensus in a multipolar political debate over how far Russia should push towards the Polish border to end this war and to stop, for the long term, the threats that NATO, the United States, and others make against Russia's survival on platforms like the Ukrainian battlefield. That's another reason why he said it. The third reason is that the Russians have contempt for the British now. The Russians believe that Trump is showing the capability to accept that the war has been lost in the Ukraine. But the British cannot accept they've lost. In fact, and you referred to the Novichok story, Prime Minister Starmer still endorses this fiction about Novichok as a Russian attack on British territory in 2018, which was one of the steps to war with Russia because they expelled dozens of Russian diplomats and got all of their allies to expel hundreds of Russian diplomats as a depiction of the Russian enemy invading everywhere, which required a war to stop them. Well, that's still Starmer's view. Starmer still thinks that. So what Medvedev is saying is really an attempt to divide Trump and the good Americans from the perfidious Albion, the bad English. Mm-hmm. And he follows it up after this insult at Lamy. But why not? Lamy is simply a little surreptitious of a failing British policy that will not accept that they've lost the war and they've had all of their weaponry lost. And by the way, Starmer has suddenly disclosed in the last 24 hours that he doesn't want to put British boots on the ground. He wants to put British boots in the air and British boots on the sea. In short, instead of ground force defense of Ukraine in a losing war, he's now talking about air defense and maritime defense offshore. It's a complete retreat by the British. And in that process, what Medvedev is saying is, look at this. The negotiation is with the United States. It's not with the European Union. They can eat Brussels sprouts, but they can't fight. They've been defeated. The British can eat fish and chips, but they've been defeated too. Macron can threaten to put his nuclear weapons into Berlin, but he can eat coq au vin and be satisfied with that. The serious matter of ending this war is between Russia and the United States. And all Medvedev is saying there is there's only one power in Europe, and that's the United States. And we're negotiating with them. So that's what he's saying also. Finally, I don't mind his tone. It's not quite as violent as Donald Trump's tone in tweets. It's funny. It's amusing. It's a joke. Mm-hmm. And all Russians can laugh at it. I don't know that too many Americans, and I'm one of them, too many Americans think Trump's tweets are funny. Do you?
No. But I must say, as a citizen of the EU, I have to agree with Medvedev's assessment of the pathetic state of the so-called leadership of this continent. If nothing else, what he's saying is a reflection of the reality. In any event, John, it has been always a great pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to our next conversation. I hope we'll be able to touch on this important subject of Novichok in some detail the next time we speak.
Thanks very much for having me, Dimitri. Thank you.
Thank you. And coming to you from Kalamata, Dimitri Lascaris for Reason to Resist on March 21st, 2025.